The year is 1992. A customer pushes through the glass door of Sylvia's Ceramics in Wichita, Kansas. The familiar chime announces their arrival to the empty shop. Ceramic figurines line the shelves, paintbrushes sit neatly arranged, and soft music plays from a radio in the back. Sylvia Porter looks up from her work, offering a friendly smile to the stranger who just walked in. She's alone, like always on Tuesday afternoons. The customer asks about a particular piece, something specific. Sylvia nods, leading them toward the back room where she keeps additional inventory. Minutes pass. The front door chime sounds again as the customer leaves. But when the next person enters 20 minutes later, they find Sylvia on the floor behind the counter, blood pooling beneath her head. The cash register sits untouched. Nothing appears stolen, just another woman dead in another strip mall along Interstate 70. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was part of something much larger, much more calculated. Something that would terrorize small business owners across the Midwest and leave investigators scrambling to connect dots along hundreds of miles of interstate highway. Between April and December of 1992, a killer stalked the corridors of America's strip malls, targeting clerks working alone in specialty shops. The attacks were swift, methodical, and seemingly random, but they weren't random at all. They followed a pattern that investigators would eventually recognize, though they'd never catch the man responsible for it. Welcome to the story of the Interstate 70 killer, a phantom who turned America's busiest highway into a hunting ground and left behind nothing but questions, ballistic evidence, and families still searching for answers 3 decades later. The first attack happened on April 8, 1992 in Indianapolis. Robin Fuldauer was working alone at her ceramics shop when a customer entered around mid-afternoon. Witnesses later described seeing a man leaving the store, but by the time Robin's body was discovered, he was long gone. She'd been shot twice in the head with a small caliber weapon. The cash register remained closed. Jewelry and ceramics worth hundreds of dollars sat undisturbed on their displays. Police initially treated it as a robbery gone wrong, despite the obvious inconsistencies. But 3 weeks later, on April 27th, another ceramics shop owner was found dead under nearly identical circumstances. Patricia Majors and her employee, Patricia Smith, were both killed at Patricia's store in Wichita. Same weapon caliber, same execution style, same lack of meaningful theft. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Someone was specifically targeting women working alone in small specialty shops. But this wasn't about money. The killer took minimal cash, if any, and ignored valuable merchandise. He was after something else entirely. By May 3rd, investigators across state lines were starting to compare notes. That's when Michael McCown was found dead at his mom-and-pop store in Terre Haute, Indiana. This time, the victim was male, but everything else remained consistent. Small shop, lone employee, minimal theft, close-range gunshot wounds from a .22 caliber weapon. The Interstate 70 killer had claimed his 4th victim, and investigators were beginning to realize they were dealing with something unprecedented. A methodical predator who used America's highway system as his personal hunting ground. What made this case particularly challenging was the killer's apparent mobility and planning. These weren't crimes of opportunity. The shops he selected were strategically chosen. Each one sat within easy access of Interstate 70, allowing for quick escape routes back onto the highway system. The timing was deliberate too. Mid-afternoon attacks when traffic was light, but businesses were still open. When employees were most likely to be working alone, ballistic evidence would eventually confirm what investigators suspected. Shell casings recovered from each scene came from the same .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The weapon hadn't been discarded or changed between attacks. This killer was confident, organized, and apparently unconcerned about leaving ballistic evidence behind. The modus operandi was disturbingly consistent. The killer would enter a shop, engage the employee in brief conversation, often asking about specific merchandise or services. Then, He'd request to see something in the back room or storage area, away from windows and potential witnesses. Once isolated, he'd produce his weapon and fire multiple shots at close range. The entire encounter lasted minutes, maybe seconds once the shooting began. Witnesses who saw him enter or leave described a white male, average height and build, probably in his 20s or 30s. He dressed unremarkably, spoke politely, and moved with purpose, but without apparent haste. Nothing about his behavior suggested violence or mental instability. He looked like any other customer browsing for ceramics or craft supplies. This normalcy was perhaps his greatest weapon. In 1992, strip mall security was minimal at best. Most shops had no surveillance cameras. Employee safety protocols were virtually non-existent. A polite customer asking to see merchandise in the back room wouldn't raise any red flags. By the time shop owners realized they were in danger, it was already too late. The geographic spread of the attacks presented another massive challenge for law enforcement. Interstate 70 stretches over 2,100 miles from Utah to Maryland, passing through 10 states and dozens of major metropolitan areas. In 1992, inter-agency communication was far more limited than today. Computer databases were primitive. Information sharing between jurisdictions was slow and often incomplete. Each local police department initially worked their cases independently. It took weeks for patterns to emerge and task forces to form. By then, the killer had already moved on to his next target, potentially hundreds of miles away. The speed of his movements suggested either extensive travel for work or a deliberate nomadic lifestyle designed to avoid detection. Investigators theorized he might be a traveling salesman, long-haul truck driver, or some other profession requiring frequent interstate travel. This would explain his familiarity with highway systems and his ability to quickly establish escape routes from unfamiliar areas. But there was something else about these attacks that bothered investigators. The victim selection seemed too specific, too targeted to be completely random. Why ceramics shops? Why craft stores and small specialty retailers? Was there significance to these particular business types, or were they simply convenient targets that met his operational requirements? The killer's comfort level in these environments suggested possible familiarity with the retail industry. He knew how to engage employees in product-related conversations. He understood store layouts and recognized when employees would be working alone. This wasn't someone randomly wandering into shops and improvising attacks. This was someone who understood the business model and vulnerabilities of small specialty retailers. As spring turned to summer, the attacks continued. Each one reinforced the pattern while adding new pieces to an increasingly complex puzzle. The killer was clearly intelligent, organized, and patient. He could blend into any environment, establish rapport with victims, and execute attacks with clinical precision. But he was also leaving clues, intentionally or not. Those .22 caliber shell casings were like signatures at each scene. Ballistic analysis confirmed they came from the same weapon, creating an unbroken chain of evidence connecting attacks across multiple states. This consistency was unusual for a spree killer. Most would dispose of weapons to avoid ballistic connections. But the Interstate 70 killer seemed unconcerned about this forensic trail. The question investigators kept returning to was simple, but haunting. What was driving this person to kill? The minimal theft ruled out robbery as a primary motive. The victim selection suggested something more specific than random violence. Was this about power and control? Sexual gratification? Some twisted mission or ideology targeting small business owners? The answer remained elusive as summer stretched into fall and the body count continued rising along America's most traveled highway. As investigators struggled to understand the killer's psychology, another disturbing attack unfolded on September 25th. Nancy Kitzmiller was working alone at a boot shop in St. Charles, Missouri, when a customer entered asking about Western wear. The conversation was brief, professional. Then came the request to see inventory in the back room. Nancy never had a chance. 2 shots to the head, minimal cash taken, and the killer disappeared back onto Interstate 70 within minutes. The St. Charles attack marked a subtle shift in the investigation. This time, a witness caught a glimpse of the suspect's vehicle, a light-colored sedan, possibly a Ford, heading toward the interstate on-ramp. It wasn't much, but it was more than investigators had before. License plates remained unreadable, but the vehicle description went out to law enforcement agencies across the region. By October, a multi-state task force had formed, coordinating efforts between Indiana, Missouri, and Kansas authorities. FBI behavioral analysts joined the investigation, developing psychological profiles based on the killer's methodology and victim selection. Their assessment painted a picture of an organized offender, likely employed in a profession requiring travel, with above-average intelligence and social skills. The profile suggested someone who could maintain normal relationships and hold steady employment while compartmentalizing his violent impulses. This wasn't a raging psychopath or obvious social outcast. This was someone who could sit next to you on an airplane, chat about the weather, and you'd never suspect he was capable of murder. But profiles only go so far without actionable leads. The killer's apparent familiarity with interstate travel patterns led investigators to focus on truck stops, hotels, and rental car agencies along the I-70 corridor. Hundreds of interviews were conducted with drivers, sales representatives, and other frequent travelers. Employment records were cross-referenced with attack dates and locations. Gun shops were canvassed for recent .22 caliber ammunition purchases. Every lead seemed to evaporate under scrutiny. The killer left virtually no trace beyond ballistic evidence and witness descriptions that could fit thousands of men. He paid cash, avoided surveillance cameras, and never lingered long enough for detailed observation. His movements along the interstate were ghost-like, materializing only long enough to kill before vanishing back into America's endless stream of highway traffic. The final confirmed attack came on December 6th in Raytown, Missouri. Store clerk Sarah Blessing was found shot behind the counter of a small gift shop, following the now familiar pattern. But something was different this time. A customer had entered the shop moments after hearing what sounded like firecrackers, finding the front door still ajar and the killer's footsteps echoing in the parking lot. This near miss seemed to spook the Interstate 70 killer. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they had begun. December stretched into January, then spring, with no new incidents matching his signature methodology. Had he moved to a different region, changed his tactics, been arrested for an unrelated crime, or simply decided his killing spree had run its course? The investigation continued for months, then years, gradually shifting from active pursuit to cold case status. Advances in forensic technology periodically breathed new life into the case. DNA analysis of evidence collected in 1992 revealed partial profiles that could potentially identify the killer if he were ever arrested and entered into databases. Age progression sketches updated the original composite drawings, showing what the suspect might look like decades later. In 2019, genetic genealogy techniques that had solved other cold cases were applied to the Interstate 70 investigation. Investigators hoped that DNA evidence might finally provide the breakthrough that traditional methods had failed to achieve. But the genetic material proved too degraded or contaminated for definitive analysis. The killer's identity remained locked away in evidence boxes and computer databases. Today, the Interstate 70 case represents one of America's most puzzling unsolved spree killings. The methodical nature of the attacks, the clear ballistic connections, and the geographic pattern should have made this solvable. But the killer's discipline, mobility, and apparent normal appearance allowed him to disappear into the vast anonymity of American highway culture. Families of the victims continue seeking closure, gathering periodically to remember their loved ones and maintain pressure on law enforcement agencies to keep investigating. Support groups formed in the aftermath still meet decades later, bound together by shared loss and unanswered questions. The case remains officially open across multiple jurisdictions. Cold case detectives periodically review evidence files, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previous investigators missed. New witnesses occasionally come forward with recovered memories or previously withheld information. Each potential lead is pursued, though most ultimately lead nowhere. What haunts investigators most is the knowledge that somewhere the Interstate 70 killer likely remains alive, possibly carrying memories of those strip mall murders while living an otherwise ordinary life. The man who terrorized small business owners across the Midwest in 1992 could be anyone's neighbor, co-worker, or family member. He might be retired now, reflecting on his past crimes with satisfaction or regret, or he might still be traveling America's highways, his violent impulses dormant but not extinguished. The Interstate 70 corridor continues bustling with commerce and travel, its strip malls and specialty shops serving millions of customers each year. But for those who remember 1992, every door chime carries an echo of that terrifying spring and summer when a simple request to see merchandise in the back room could mean the difference between life and death. Until someone comes forward with information, until DNA technology advances enough to process degraded samples, or until the killer himself decides to confess, the Interstate 70 murders will remain America's most methodical unsolved spree killing. 8 victims, 1 weapon, hundreds of miles of highway, and a ghost who vanished as mysteriously as he appeared, leaving behind only questions that have haunted investigators for more than 3 decades. The map remains unfinished, the case files still open, and families still waiting for the phone call that might finally bring them the answers they deserve.